Welcome back. Yes,
Yeah.
It's been a while, and because it's been a while, we're going to do a little bit of revision also, both because it's been a big gap and because we have people here who were not part of this last series of sessions. So to just recap a little bit, I think would be a good idea. If you have the book, we're on page 40, because we've just started, not so long ago, we started chapter 10, but we're going to review some of what we've been learning. But before we review this chapter, we need to review the history that got us to this point of this chapter. In other words, where are we coming from and what have we achieved? What have we learned so far? So we have the following. First of all, very high level. I think pretty much everybody who's here is familiar with Tanya, but just at a high level, what is Tanya all about? So Tanya is the key of all Chabad Hasidic philosophy. So all Chabad Hasidic philosophy is built on the Tanya, and the purpose of Tanya is it's divided into a number of different sections. We're learning the first section. The first section is all about ourselves, how we operate, how our soul operates, what our soul is about, etc., etc. So that's really where we are right now. To very briefly summarize what we've done in the preceding chapters, it goes like this. Chapter 1 obviously painted the picture of where we're supposed to go in our conversations. And chapter 1 asked some very loaded questions. And you could summarize those questions into two questions. Number 1, what are we doing here? And number 2, how do we do it? Is that a good summary, Stan? What are we doing here and how do we do it? Which means we have to ask ourselves the question, why did our neshama enter into this world? Apparently we have a neshama that was on this great spiritual journey before it came into our consciousness. So why did it have to come into our consciousness? What do we need it for? What do we need these issues of having to do things like pay taxes and sit in traffic and fight with people who don't like us? What do we need all of that sorrows for, right? And the second question is how? How do we get the value, whatever it is that we're supposed to achieve, being here? How do we actually achieve it? Okay, so those are the two questions. What do I mean specifically by those two questions? So we started off with a quotation. The Talmud says that before a neshama enters into this world, whoever they is, the heavenly administration, effectively calls on that neshama to make a promise. Swear that you will be a tzaddik and that you will not be a rasha. What's a tzaddik? We don't know. When we start off our exploration of Tanya, we think that a tzaddik is a nice guy. And pretty much, I think most of us would best summarize what a tzaddik is by saying, it's me with some improvements. That would be a tzaddik. Me with some improvements. And if you are really, really on the right page, then you'd say, and my spouse is already a tzaddik. Then you're on the right channel, the right frequency. So you're supposed to take an oath to be a tzaddik and equally take an oath at the same time not to be a rasha. Okay, so we know what a rasha is. A rasha is a bad person. A rasha is a tyrant. A rasha is a criminal. Okay, so obviously I'm not going to be a rasha. So okay, makes a lot of sense. Before we're born, they tell us, be good, don't be bad. But the first question that we asked was, why do you have to take this oath, and why do you have to have both sides of the oath? And isn't it, a little bit self-defeating to have this expectation? I have to become a tzaddik, when straight afterwards he quotes another source, also in the Talmud, that says that even if the entire world tells you that you are a tzaddik, it's part of the same conversation. The whole world tells you that you're a tzaddik, don't believe them. Always see yourself as a rasha. Also, in plain English, that often means that the same spouse that you call a tzaddik might remind you that you're not. It's part of the dynamics of marriage, yeah? The same person that you're supposed to call a tzaddik, whatever. So that started us on a whole conversation, and a big part of that conversation was that we discovered there's something that lies in between a tzaddik and a rasha, and it's called a beinoni. And most people think that a beinoni, that's actually me, because a tzaddik is me with some improvements, and a rasha would be me if I let the wheels come off, so I'm probably in the middle, I must be a beinoni. But then on examination, we discovered that it's really difficult to be a beinoni, because in order to qualify as a beinoni, just at a very high level, you pretty much can never do anything wrong, because if you do something wrong, you're now a rasha. So that really got us intrigued, and that was the big hard-hitting question. So what is a Benoni? Because that appears to possibly be the reason our neshama came into this world. And then how do we do it? How do we get there? And that's what's going to propel the conversation for the first 53 chapters of Tanya, of which we are in the beginning of chapter 10. In other words, we've got a way to go. In chapters 1 and 2, towards the end of chapter 1, he introduced the principle, and in chapter 2 explained the principle. He tells us you have to realize that we have two souls. That's really important information. Because if we want to understand how to improve ourselves, we have to know what we're working with. And if we don't know what we're working with, and we don't know how we operate, how could we possibly get anywhere? That's literally like climbing into a car and having no idea how to start the ignition and thinking that you can drive. I recently heard a young person who said, I know how to ride a bicycle. How much more difficult could it be to drive a car? Well, basically wouldn't want necessarily to allow them behind the wheel with that approach, right? So if I don't know how the thing works, if I don't know how the machine works, how can I possibly use it effectively? Although, in today's world, quite frankly, I'm sure Rowan will agree with us. Russ will also agree with us. There are many, many people who have access to technology that they have no idea what they do. They think they know how to use it. They think they know what they're doing. They haven't even, started. And it's pretty much the same with our own soul. We think we know what we're doing. I know my soul. I know myself. People say, I know myself. I understand myself, and I know how to. I know that I'm a good person, because obviously everybody will tell you that they're a good person, right? They won't necessarily agree that everybody else is a good person. I know that I'm a good person. If you ask Anthony, he'll tell you that he's not only a good person, he's also sane. It's a big achievement, right? Can't say the same for everybody else. But the point is that we all have a sense that we know what we're doing, and we don't necessarily know what we're doing. So in order to get somewhere, what we've got to do is first discuss the fact that we don't have a soul, because that's misleading. We have two souls. Then in chapters 3, 4, 5, he gives us a tremendous insight into the one soul, the more important of our souls, but the less known of our souls, which is the godly soul, the piece of Hashem that lives inside of us. And then in chapters 6, 7, and 8, he gives us the other side, that we also have an animal soul, which is very base and very materialistic and very self-centered. And then in chapter 9, he says, throw them in the ring. So you've got the godly soul that's trying to aspire to tremendously high and altruistic things, and you've got it, on the other hand, being tackled by the animal soul that says, feed me. So you put the two of them into a ring, and that's pretty much what it means to be human, or specifically to be Jewish. So we've got this tug-of-war that's happening between the two sides of our being, which each one of them is a full soul with faculties and abilities and greatness. In plain English, what does that mean? Don't be surprised if you could be absolutely inspired 1 minute and totally deflated the next. Don't be surprised if you could feel like you have imposter syndrome. Who's the real me? What's the real me? Is the real me the one that gets inspired from shul, from davening, from learning, from doing a mitzvah, from sharing with other people? Or is the real me the part of me that never wants to have that experience? God forbid I should be inspired. Who knows what could happen next? It's a dangerous thing, this inspiration. Might make you change your life. Who's the real me? Is the real me the one who believes that God is with us at all times, that miracles will happen and life will be good? Or is the real me who's angry at God right now because of the way things have actually turned out? Who's the real me? So that 9th chapter helps us to understand both are the real me. Both are the conscious me. The different phases of which soul is expressing itself at any given point, and they are literally in a perpetual battle for control, and each one wishes that we would always live with their perspective and with their behavior. Which brings us to the chapter that we're on now, chapter 10. Chapter 10 takes us back to that tzaddik. That tzaddik that right at the beginning we thought was just a really lovely person? That tzaddik that we thought was anybody who's nice to me. That's how many, many people understand. You're a tzaddik because you were good to me. And so was a Rasha because they were nasty to me. So we're now going back to that tzaddik with a lot more information, understanding that we have these two souls, that the one is rooted in God and the other one is rooted in what we've called klippa, which is an aberration or a blockage, an obstruction to God. Now we know the dynamics. Let's go back and say, so what is a tzaddik? Now the way we started this chapter was with a little bit of a surprise. We said that actually the first kind of tzaddik, and this is pretty much where we are at the moment, the first kind of a tzaddik, because nobody tells you that there are many kinds of tzaddikim. We're going to look at two categories because the Talmud splits them into two categories. The first kind of a tzaddik is what is called tzaddik ve'ra-loi. Anybody know what that means? Tzaddik ve'ra-loi. How would you translate that? Tzaddik is pious or righteous, and it's bad for them. Tzaddik ve'ra-loi. A tzaddik, and things are bad for them. Life is bad for them. It is bad for them. It doesn't qualify what is bad for them. So what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear that designation? A tzaddik, that it's bad for them. It's the first thought. Just don't overthink it. The first thought that comes to your mind when you hear of the designation of a tzaddik ve'ra-loi, and bad for them. What do you think? What do you think it means?
Good person and bad things.
Correct. The first thing that would come to a person's mind, that's nice. Somebody put in the chat over here, me. Right? Tzaddik ve'ra-loi. I'm a good person and bad things happen. Or I'm a good person and it's not as good as I should be. Right? Those are two possibilities. So I think the most common interpretation that people have of tzaddik ve'ra-loi is good person, like genuinely good person, ve'ra-loi, and bad things happen to them. And that, of course, raises one of our greatest philosophical dilemmas in life. Why? Why would that be the case? Why would bad things happen to good people? I don't know about you. I could nominate a number of people who are better, better candidates for bad things than a lot of people who have bad things. So that is the most basic interpretation, understanding of tzaddik ve'ra-loi. Tzaddik, that it's bad for them, means good spiritually, bad life experience. All right, now let's dig a little deeper. Can you think of any other way to interpret this? That is a valid interpretation. It's not the only interpretation. So can you think of another way to interpret tzaddik ve'ra-loi? Any suggestions? Okay, so let's look at it. What's that?
Have he got any? The tzaddik got any bad traits?
Okay, so tzaddik, the person is a tzaddik, ve'ra-loi, and there's still some negative traits in their character, right? That's what you're saying. So they still have, so they're not 100% perfect. And that comes as quite a surprise to us, because we naturally think, at least when you read Jewish literature, you always tend to imagine that a tzaddik is somebody who is perfect, the top of the pops. They don't have any problems, aberrations, temptations, failures. But here's the expression tzaddik ve'ra-loi, which, by the way, the Gemara interprets as tzaddik she'einoi gomor, a tzaddik who is not a complete tzaddik. So that comes as a surprise to us. May not come as a surprise to many people, because many people will tell you that nobody's perfect, and obviously you expect that a tzaddik has some failures, but it does come as a surprise to us, because in the literature of Judaism, a tzaddik is always on such a high platform and held in such great esteem. You almost get the impression that they don't ever do anything wrong. And now we're saying that, well, there's the possibility of a tzaddik ve'ra-loi, a tzaddik for whom things are not all hunky-dory. There's a bit of ra, there's a little bit of negativity somewhere trapped or in some dark corner of their character. So that was the surprise that we started this chapter with, is let's explore the tzaddik ve'ra-loi, the fact that there's the possibility of the imperfect or incomplete tzaddik. Before we continue, though, let's just remind ourselves that in chapter 1, which was the first time that we ever came across the word tzaddik and the designations of this kind of tzaddik and that kind of tzaddik, we also touched on a Kabbalistic reference in Raya Mehemna, which is a section of the Zohar, which is the principal work of Jewish mysticism, that says tzaddik ve'ra-loi means that the person is a tzaddik ve plus ra, whatever negative might exist in their world, loi is under their jurisdiction. That's an interesting principle, right? Ra loy. So possibly the best way to interpret this would be as follows. It's an interesting one, okay? So what's a more realistic scenario? Is a more realistic scenario a city that has no criminals, or a city that has a strong criminal justice system? Which is the more realistic scenario? I mean, we'd all love, of course, to live in a place where there are no criminals. Which is the more realistic scenario? A strong criminal justice system, right? So in a city that has a strong criminal justice system, are there bad people in the city? Yes. But is the city a bad place? No. Why? Because the bad people are behind bars. So the Ra is loy. The Ra is under our very tight control in a city that has a strong system, a strong criminal justice system. Okay? So we don't go about executing criminals, and we don't even necessarily succeed in rehabilitating criminals, but we do succeed in putting them where they can't harm us. That's what a tzaddik vera loy is from the perspective of mysticism. Whatever negative elements might exist within that person's mind, within their character, is so well managed that it can never actually flare up in their lives. Hence, they're a tzaddik. That's how we started this chapter, and of course we're going to get to the point, which is what we were meant to have done last time, and possibly we'll get to do this time, and that is to compare it to the other kind of a tzaddik, what is called a tzaddik gomor, a complete tzaddik, or to compare apples to apples, tzaddik v'toiv loy, a tzaddik who has good for them or with them. Okay, so that's where we're going to go this evening, just to make it a little bit of fun, because when you have a big gap or when you have people participating for the first time, you don't necessarily have the flow. So we're actually going to read from the top of the chapter. Again, it's on page 40. That's using the page numbers that are at the bottom of the page. And you'll see there, chapter 10, well, obviously the English is the preceding page, but you'll see in the middle, Perek Yud. So we're going to go literally from the beginning, just to get the flow. But I'm going to go through the first section a little bit quicker, because it is information we've already studied, at least some of us have studied together, and let's get to where we need to be this evening. Vehine. So he starts off by saying, when a person is able to overpower with their godly soul, to be able to battle the animal soul. Now let's just pause for a second. We all know that we have this battle raging inside of ourselves all the time. Everybody has their own battle, everybody has their own issues, their own temptations, their own vices. But everybody has a battle. If God forbid a person does not have a battle inside of themselves, we should take their pulse. Because that's the human experience. We are conflicted. We do have our paradoxes. We do have our sense of hypocrisy, internal sense of hypocrisy. That's just how it is. So anybody who has that battle has to ask themselves this question: how often does the better side of my character get to have the upper hand? Now, be careful how we answer this, because we might say, what do you mean? I'm a good person. Like I said, everybody says they're a good person. I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with people who are in a state of conflict. Ever try to mediate a conflict? What happens when you try to mediate a conflict? You have these two people who swear about each other that they are the worst humans on earth. But when you speak to each of them individually, they'll always say, it's guaranteed, in every mediation, in every conflict, they will always say at some point, I don't think I'm a bad person. So we're not asking if we're good or bad people. There's a lot of time where there is not a live conflict. There's a lot of areas in our life where we just go about our business. We don't feel that tension. So I'm not asking about that. I'm asking when the tensions flare. When we are feeling demotivated, and now we have to motivate ourselves. When we are feeling tempted to do or say something that we shouldn't, and we have to control ourselves. How often does our better side get to have the upper hand? You do not have to answer this question. It's for reflection purposes only. We don't expose anybody. But the reality is, we all know that we have those particular areas where we keep promising ourselves, I'm not going to lose my temper. I'm not going to avoid what I have to do and procrastinate and play another round of Candy Crush or whatever the case is. I'm actually going to succeed this time. And then we don't. And then we let ourselves down, right? So we all know that that happens a lot. And here we're distinguishing that what's unique about a person to enter the world of the tzaddik is they actually win those battles. That's why it says, "V'nilcham kol kachim abahamis." The person gets their godly soul to have such a strong battle against their animal soul, ad shemegoresh umevaer harasheba michal asmali, to the extent that can literally expunge all the negativity that sits in their heart. In chapter, well, we did it in two places, but in chapter 9 specifically, we spoke about the idea that the neshama, we're going to use that word, right? The neshama we're going to use generically to refer to the divine soul, otherwise known as the nefesh elokis. So the neshama's primary platform of operations is the mind, because the mind allows you to be objective. The mind allows you to understand the value of things that are not self-serving. So that's the platform that the neshama is going to use. Whereas the nefesh abahamis, the animal soul, is primarily going to be in the space of the heart. The heart meaning to say subjective, self-interested responses. So now, the heart is not bad. We should never get that impression, because emotions are very much a part of how we grow as people and how we connect to Hashem. Can't have a connection to Hashem without emotion. Can't develop as a spiritual person without emotion. There has to be passion, or as we call it, ahava, which people usually translate just simply as love. But love is such an abused term in the English language, right? Because you could love Hashem, you could love your spouse, and you could love soccer. It's and exactly. So it's, it kind of loses a lot of its value, whereas passion hopefully illustrates that you're much more invested in something, right? And in order to have a relationship with Hashem, it's got to be a passionate relationship. You should not necessarily have a passion for chocolate. I mean, you might well enjoy chocolate or chicken, but kosher Nando's, obviously, obviously goes without saying. The only kosher Nando's. So anyway, so we're not saying that the heart is bad or objectionable. We're identifying the fact that our heart operates in two possible ways. A very self-interested way, which we nickname the left side of the heart, because left generally in Judaism is associated with things that are more obstructive to a connection to Hashem. And we have what we call the right-hand side of the heart, which is the healthier part of the heart, that is open to more mature, appropriate emotional attachment. So where is a person going to attract negative sentiment? In the so-called left-hand side of the heart. In other words, the self-interested part of my emotional makeup, that's the part that's most likely to get caught up in things like anger or hedonism or laziness, despair. We're not going to get into the A word, anxiety. It's very triggering for many people in today's world, so we're going to leave that for now. We'll come back to it on another occasion. Please God, when we get to chapter 25, then we can talk about depression and anxiety from a spiritual perspective. So now I've created anxiety, obviously, by saying you have to wait until chapter 25. So the thing is this, that what's considered a success story is where a person ramps up the impact of their own neshama in their own life to such an extent that it actually edges out the negative part of the heart, the negative predisposition of what could become unhealthy emotions. So that's now the language of a tzaddik. You understand? Tzaddik is not just somebody who behaves right. That's the mistake we make. We look at people and say, oh, they behave right, there must be a tzaddik. Or the word that's much worse than tzaddik that people use, there must be frum. As if that's, number one, a real definition of a person. because I think it's a moving target. From is exactly like driving on the road. The person in front of you is going too slow, and the person behind you is a meshugana. And it's exactly the same with from. Anybody who's more observant than me is crazy, and anybody who's less observant than me is hardly Jewish. So from is a moving target. It's not a great way to refer to people. But how do you define somebody as from? Usually, look at what they do. They do all these things. They are so on the ball, They keep the highest standard of kashrut, so they can't eat in anybody's house. And they are so careful about Shabbos that you can't even pick anything up. You walk into the house, you feel like you're walking on eggshells because you can't touch that because it's muktzah, and you can't do this because you can't talk this way. Whatever, they vary from. What we've just discovered is our first insight into the fact that a tzaddik is not measured by behavior. Spoiler alert, there are many very from Russia category people. Don't tell them because it'd be offensive. But that's the reality. Many people in the frum world, by the designation of what we're going to learn, are very much in the Russia category. Why? Because it's not a measure of what we do. It's a measure of how much internal work we have succeeded with. So as you see over here, the tzaddik is shifting where they are in terms of response, in terms of emotion, in terms of subjective involvement, rather than just, I do these things. Okay, that's really important information. And then he quotes, like King David says, like the Torah tells us, ostensibly the Torah is talking to the Jewish nation on the whole. It's telling us about idolatry, that you've got to get idolatry out of the nation. But it is stated in the singular, which tells us that there's also a requirement for us to excise whatever negative lives inside of ourselves. So that's what the tzaddik is doing. Now, at this point in time, you meet somebody. Can you imagine meeting somebody who no longer feels temptation? I'm saying for the wrong things. Could you imagine meeting somebody like that? Again, we'd say you should probably take their pulse. Just imagine that. Imagine for 1 second. We sit around at the table and we've got a juicy piece of gossip to share. And then we've got to have this whole debate. Do I say it? Don't I say it? Is it Lashon Hora? Is it not Lashon Hora? What's the halachic consideration? But it's already public knowledge, so I could say it anyway. We have this whole thing going on inside our heads about whether or not it's appropriate to share something negative about somebody else. And the tzaddik sitting at the same table, who might be the person who has the juiciest gossip of all, has absolutely no interest in sharing it. If it's not appropriate, it doesn't interest me. Can you imagine that? It's like far-fetched for us. It's a little bit sci-fi for us. And the same applies to whatever it is, temptations, focus, prioritizing correctly. The reason we generally misprioritize things is because we have self-interest. The tzaddik doesn't have this issue. Can you imagine? Just doesn't have this issue. It's always on point, always appropriate, always committed to the right things. Why? Because they've pushed out the toxic emotions. So now this is no longer from. This is no longer a measure of observance. This is a transformed human. So why do you call this person imperfect? Wow. This is incredible. This is something that's light years away from us. Sorry, but we've just realized that a tzaddik is no longer me with minor improvements. This is me with extreme makeover to become a tzaddik. Can you imagine? Just try and imagine for 1 second. Think of whatever it is. I don't know. Some people, perhaps present company excluded, obviously. Some people may have grown up not keeping kosher. And then they became religious at some point in time and they started to keep kosher. You know people like this? And then they have their favorite restaurant that they used to eat at before they started to keep kosher. So if you know the generational history of Johannesburg Jewry, the black steer, that is a big challenge. I don't know if it doesn't exist. They've redone that the whole complex, right? But that used to be or maybe Mike's Kitchen. Like that used to be the thing for many people who became kosher later in life. They would reminisce about the black steer. Right? Not going to go LM prawns. So in the days that it still existed, it was geographically very challenging for the Frum community. It was literally on the doorstep of the highest concentration of Frum Jews in Joburg, right? So I have no doubt that there were people who used to drive past nostalgically, playing the shir in their car on the radio and rolling down the window just to catch a whiff, just to have a bit of an experience, take some of the nostalgia, some of the pleasure associated with the good old days, and the maybe not so good old days. Now the tzaddik wouldn't ever have this issue. Firstly, the tzaddik would have grown up most likely kosher, although not guaranteed. We have tzaddikim in history who literally came in from the cold. But the point is, the tzaddik would never have this issue. Would never have the issue of, oh, I wish that I could be like certain other groups, like the Amish, or whatever. Get a few months off. Could just go and try these things. Tzaddik, it's not a factor. It's not in their experience. So you're telling me this person is imperfect. How much better than that could you get? So here comes the point where we have to focus today. So nikrat tzaddik, ve'ein hora nefach l'toiv mamish. What this person has not yet succeeded in doing, so this is our big clue, is they have not yet converted the negative into positive. Or in the language of the criminal justice system, they have not rehabilitated the criminal to become a productive member of society. This is, of course, the internal criminal that we're talking about. So that person is called nikrat tzaddik she'enoi gomor. That person is designated as an imperfect tzaddik. V'tzaddik v'raloi, and the tzaddik still has some negative in their, not just life experience, but inside their character, inside themselves. Why dahainu? Because sheyesh boy adayin me'at mizei ra, because they still have criminals living inside their city. Where b'chalal asmali, on that left-hand side of the heart, which is susceptible to impurities. Ela shekafuf ubatil l'toiv. The only thing is that whatever negative lives still inside their city, or their personal city, because remember in chapter 9 we spoke about ourselves as a city, so the criminals still live inside the city, but kafuf, they are bound. They're in prison. And therefore, batil, they have no contribution, they have no say. Nobody's going to listen to them. Nobody's going polling the criminals about how the city should work. And the reason is because machmas mi'utoi, because they have been so diminished, the negative has been so diminished that you get the impression it's not there anymore. Let's use a little example to illustrate this. So you know how the laws of kashrut work. What happens is what we call common kitchen nightmares. Common kosher kitchen nightmares. What happens if somebody is preparing a pot of what? It's a Jewish home?
Soup.
Chicken soup, yes. Although chicken soup makes this too easy, so it's cholent. They're making a nice lamb cholent, because halachically there is a difference between an accident that happens to chicken versus an accident that happens to red meat. So they're making a big fancy lamb cholent for shul, obviously, as Jeff will tell you. So they're making this big fancy cholent, and the guys come as a group to make the cholent before Shabbos, and there's drinks. This is the tradition. So while you're cutting, chopping, spicing, adding, whatever you're doing, you have drinks at the same time. So one time somebody arrives and they've got Dom Pedro. That's how they come to the cholent making, which is not a good idea. And somebody says to them, you can't bring that in here. There's milk in the Dom Pedro, and this is meat, and it's a kosher kitchen. So they get so startled by the reaction that they jump back, and the whole thing goes flying, and it lands up inside the cholent. So now we have cholent a la Pedro. Okay? So what do you do now, halachically? What do you do? You can't cry over spilt milk, exactly.
Depends how much of the Pedro.
Exactly. So what's the halacha? The halacha is there enough cholent to cancel the dairy that's entered the cholent and make it as if it does not exist. Now, in order to ascertain this, we do not send a cholent sample to the forensic laboratory, because then there'll always be evidence. Obviously, there'll be particles of dairy product inside the cholent. That's not required. All that's required is you have to know that the volume of cholent is enough against the volume of dairy that it cancels the impact of the dairy. And that's a 60-to-1 ratio. So if it's a nice big shul cholent pot and it's 1 cup of Don Pedro, you're good. Because that cholent pot is more than 60 cups big. Besides the fact that the Don Pedro is not all milk, right? Okay, so you're good. That's this tzaddik. If you examined this tzaddik under the spiritual microscope, would you find particles of negativity inside them?
Yes.
Yes. But we're not required to bring a microscope. That's not how we're supposed to look at people. I mean, I know it's very much how the Jewish community often does look at people, but it's not how we're meant to look at people. You're supposed to, and this includes how the person is supposed to self-assess. They self-assess and say, there is such an overwhelming sense of neshama in my life that all my toxic behaviors have reduced to the point that they are technically irrelevant. So, objectively, they still exist, but practically, they're irrelevant. Objectively, there are particles of dairy in this cholent. Practically, who cares? It's not going to change the cholent. It's not enough to affect the cholent. There's not enough negative inside this tzaddik to ever affect his life again. So, objectively, he's not perfect. We'll call him tzaddik she'enoi gomer. He's not perfect because there are these tiny internal imperfections. But practically, he's a tzaddik. That makes sense? Velochein. Now we're talking as if the tzaddik was in the room, as if we were having a one-on-one with the tzaddik, a coaching session with the tzaddik, and we were telling the tzaddik, okay, listen, you've achieved amazing and great things, but we do at the same time have to have a reality check. Here's the reality check. Velochein nidme loi. The tzaddik has done such a great job of overwhelming the negative with positive that they now imagine, nidme, it's a very specific word, they imagine ki vayigorsheu vayelech loi kuloi legamrei. They imagine that they have gotten rid of all of those particles of negative. And you can't blame them. And not only can you not blame them, why would you expect anything more? They feel that there's no longer a tug to the negative. So what's the difference? If I brought my, highfalutin, newfangled technologies that could scan them, like a spiritual PET scan, and work out what's really lying inside every cell, what's the difference? Since when is Judaism about that level of, detail? I'm saying internal detail. Surely, you're doing the right thing. You're not going to be tempted. Surely that's good enough. So we say reality check. Tzaddik, you have to understand one very important thing. This is your reality check. Nidme, you are now living with an impression about yourself that vayigosheyu vayelech loi kuloi legamrei, that you have completely expelled every last vestige of whatever wasn't so healthy inside you. Now, why is that important to know? Besides the fact that it sounds like a really Jewish thing to do. You've got somebody who's achieved and succeeded. It sounds like a very Jewish thing to say, yes, but. Right? Just let the guy be happy. He's a tzaddik. Let him celebrate his tzaddikhood. Why is this information so valuable? So he continues. Because truthfully speaking, if a person really succeeded in expelling every last drop of negative energy or character, then kol hara sheboy hayanefach letoiv mamash. The only way to expel negative is by turning it into positive. That's why he needs to know this. The goal of being Jewish, and the reason why Hashem sent our soul into this world, where there's so much negativity in this world, is not just simply to reclaim the innocence that our soul had on high. Because then there's no net gain if you think about it. So your soul was completely innocent, then it entered this world with all of its challenges and temptations and distractions. Then it fought and overcame all of those temptations and distractions and became innocent as it was before. So where was the value in the exercise? You basically landed up where you started. What's the point? So the point really is to bring something back with us. So the expression that we use sometimes, there's a verse that uses this expression, Lohoitzi yakar mizoilel, to extract something of great value out of something that is worthless. Think of mining. We're South Africans, we can relate to this. You don't drop a shaft to bring out ore. You go 2 kilometers down under the ground and blast away tunnels. Okay, tunnels is a tricky word at the moment. But you blast this whole mining system so that you can get out the ore, so that you can extract the gold from the ore, and the value of the gold is going to make it worthwhile to sink all of that investment into the mine. It's no different when you plant a seed. The Gemara says it simply. Simple economics 101. You plant a seed so that you will get a yield of a kor. A kor was almost like a bushel or a large amount of wheat. You don't plant a seed to get one stalk. You don't plant. We had a big simcha in our family this week because we successfully got avocados from our avocado tree. We have lived in this house for 25 years, almost 25 years, and we've never yet succeeded in getting the avos before they fall off the tree and smash to smithereens. So, because they're always from very, very high for whatever reason, and it only produces very few we got avocados off the tree. It's a big simcha in the house. Everybody's waiting, watching when they're going to be ripe, and then we're going to have some kind of a thing. So the point is, thank you. So people get different things for a silver anniversary. We got avocados. So the point is, you don't plant a tree to get one fruit, one seed, one fruit. You plant a tree to get many fruits. You don't plant a soul in this murky world of ours to just get return to sender. So the objective is to chap what lies in the dark and bring it into the side of light. So the tzaddik is incredible because the tzaddik has achieved a part where the darkness cannot ever overcome the light in his life. But he's not a perfect tzaddik yet because none of that darkness has become light yet. And that will be our segue into learning what a perfect tzaddik is, which, please God, we will do next week.